Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Access and Awareness webinar series hosted by the Federal Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice. I'm Dr. Siobhan Tarver-Whitlock. I'm a physical scientist with the EPA Region 4 Office of Environmental Justice and Sustainability, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Today's webinar, Whole Community Disaster Planning, Inclusive Approaches to Recovery and Preparedness, is the 7th webinar in this series. Our presentation today has two main goals. The first goal is to learn from local leaders on how their efforts are supporting and strengthening community leaders, networks, and assets so that these resources can be leveraged and empowered to improve resilience, public health, and community access to information and resources. The second goal is to learn about federal efforts to support whole community disaster planning and also to share lessons learned during recovery for recent disasters that can help improve disaster planning to better address the needs of all stakeholders, especially those who historically may have not participated in local planning processes and preparedness measures. We hope these on-the-ground examples will provide transferable models for participants to explore and consider when working within their own communities. If at any point during the presentation you have questions, please type them in the Q&A pods on the middle left-hand side of the webinar room on your screen. There'll also be time after each presentation segment to ask your questions. Again, they'll be submitted through the Q&A pod. Until we get the Q&A portion, please keep your phones on mute. We ask that you pay attention and listen. We've got some great information to share with you today. We do have over 200 people logged in today for the webinar, so I want to dive right in so that we can make sure that we answer as many questions as possible. Now, we have some great speakers for you today, and with the exception of Dr. Martin, all of them will be available at the end of the webinar to answer any additional questions that you have. Also, please pay attention to the bottom left-hand corner, of your pod that says resources and materials. The presentation is available for downloading after this segment. And so with that, we're going to jump right into presentation so that we can get all of this great information shared with everyone. We're going to start out with Dr. Atia Martin, our first presenter. She's the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Boston, and she'll provide our first case study and talk about her work in public health and resilience on the ground in Boston. The title of her presentation is Equity and Resilience Planning in the City of Boston. Dr. Martin, you now have the floor.
Good afternoon. I actually lost my connection to the webinar for some reason, but it looks like I'm coming back in. So I think just a good place to begin is to give a brief overview of the process, just in terms of where I'm trying to go for today. So first and foremost, would like to make sure that I am providing context on the research that I am presenting today, which is part of my doctorate, and really trying to understand the connection between socially vulnerable populations. Many of us in the field of emergency management and homeland security have seen the long list of vulnerable populations that can go on for pages. Really, how do we understand who's most vulnerable and from a practical perspective so that we can better understand what that means for how we need to think about preparedness, how we need to think about planning, response, recovery, and mitigation. So for today, what I will do is, how do I go to the next slide? Okay, there we go. Sorry about that, everyone. So I really focused on cities as part of this and thinking about inclusive emergency planning, really because we know that the majority of populations live in cities, both internationally. So for the first time in human history, several years ago, we reached a point where the majority of people across the world lived in cities. And in the United States, as many as 80% of the population living in cities within the United States. We have within cities incredibly dense populations in terms of people, assets, and infrastructure. And they are disproportionately impacted by disasters because of the intricate, complex relationships across all the different people, assets, and infrastructure, as well as the concentration of socially vulnerable populations within urban environments. Next slide. So the other part of this is the actual people who live in cities. So we know, as I mentioned before, that we have this high concentration of socially vulnerable populations in urban environments, that there's a combination of circumstances that increase vulnerability. So people can belong to multiple categories of vulnerable populations, and that in and of itself increases vulnerability. And then the other piece is that it varies by neighborhood, which is common sense, but just in thinking about how do we make sure that we have the understanding, not just of the demographics from a numbers perspective, but also the relationships within neighborhoods to understand how that actually looks on the ground from a context expertise perspective that communities can provide. Next slide. So for what we've been doing in emergency management and resilience and within the context of people in critical infrastructure access and environment, we generally have leaned very heavily on preparing and dealing with the stuff side of the house and less so on the people side. And we've done a much better job over the last several years of explicitly laying out how people are disproportionately impacted by disasters and emergencies, but really looking at the integration of those considerations and not something separate from all the other components of emergency management that we deal with. And as we know...
Hi, Dr. Martin.
Hi, Dr. Martin. Hi, Dr. Martin. Oh, yes.
Sorry, can you just speak up a little bit? The audience is having a little bit of trouble hearing you.
No problem. Is this better?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, no problem. So just in terms of the way we've been looking at emergency management and resilience up to this point, has really been kind of this exclusion of people from the bigger picture of how we think about emergency management. It's kind of a separate piece on the side. So this is an opportunity for us to really integrate those concepts. So for the research that I did, I looked at how do we better understand the most vulnerable populations. What is the literature telling us about the relationship between the long list of vulnerable populations that we have seen and the relationship between those factors across different issue areas. And then once that was established, looking at how does the framework actually apply if you look at a city and look at real data, does it actually align? So just from the preliminary literature review and looking at what are some of the challenges to inclusive emergency planning, some key ones jumped up out of the literature. Number one, the perceptions about preparedness, so this idea that everyone is supposed to have 7 days of food and water and all the things that we tell folks to do to prepare for emergencies, and the realities that most people who are part of marginalized groups and vulnerable populations can't do all of the things we expect of them. And so how do we take a we approach as opposed to what you need to be doing as individuals, people over there? So how do we have a collective approach to this and better understand what those needs are, which gets to actually identifying who's most vulnerable. Again, that long list of vulnerable populations are challenging to actually put into practice. So how do we actually do that? The other piece is specific guidance on what do you do in order to actually move towards a more equitable, inclusive approach to planning. There's been a lot of guidance for how to do that for people with disabilities because of the amazing work of the disabilities advocacy groups in being able to lobby as well as develop and partner on developing those tools with government, with other organizations. but that it's very limited in terms of different groups. And so how do we better help practitioners to be able to implement this work? And then the last one is limited understanding of legal implications. So for people with disabilities, there's the ability to actually bring lawsuits before there's an emergency because of the federal laws around people with disabilities, the whole range of them. But for other socially vulnerable groups, marginalized, who are actually covered under many of the federal laws, there's no ability to sue ahead of time, but there can be lawsuits afterwards. And we see that after disasters, and it doesn't get a lot of coverage, but there is significant documentation of people and organizations suing local, state, federal government after emergencies because of potential violations of vulnerable populations' rights, mainly unintentionally.
Hi, Dr. Martin. I'm sorry to interrupt you again. It seems like your voice is trailing off a little bit. Can you speak a little bit closer to the phone?
I have it all the way up. Let me just make an adjustment to see if that will help. Okay, is this better?
Yes.
Okay. So when we talk about socially vulnerable populations, because the list is so long, there's ways to categorically talk about it. So this is leveraging the CDC Public Health Toolkit, large categorical organization of different vulnerable populations for the purposes of brevity. So economic disadvantage. We can move forward. Which is at or below the poverty level, working poor, people who are homeless, right? So this is very straightforward. When we think about language and literacy, both the limited ability to read, speak, write, and understand English, as well as read and write in their own language as well. And then the inclusion of people with limited ability to, I covered that, they'll do that in their own language. You can move forward. Is there a way for me to control the slide?
Yes, Dr. Martin. At the bottom of the screen, there's forward arrow. In addition, can you meet on your computer, please?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay.
Everyone, we do apologize that you just hang on with us a little bit while we
Okay, so do I sound better now?
Yes, ma'am. You sound fine.
Okay, perfect. And then you said the ability to advance the slides is on the screen?
Yes, at the very bottom of the slide, arrow pointing forward.
Yeah, I don't have that on my screen.
Okay, well, I'm just going to need you to advance them, and I'll advance.
Perfect, thank you. So, and then last but not, age is very straightforward. Medical issues and disabilities are straightforward. And then isolation, and this was a way to capture some of the more historically and socially marginalized groups. So that includes people of color and others who we have a long history of policies and practices that have resulted in inequities that we see today that lead to folks being socially vulnerable. So the way that I went through the literature in order to arrive there, I won't go into the details, but basically using network analysis in looking at what are all of the connections that folks, so between the different socially vulnerable populations. So here you just get a sense of the 6 that jumped out from the original list, which started with over 60 different categories. So there were 5 that had the most connections to other socially vulnerable populations as shown here, and I'll go through this in a little bit more detail, but this just gives you a sense of all of the different ways that folks were connected to other vulnerable populations. And this is just another view that gives you a sense of also the post-incident. So we looked at both the vulnerable populations that were connected to one another pre-incident, as well as some of the outcomes after disaster. So that includes displacement, domestic violence, loss of employment, loss of loved ones, and some other factors that I'll go into a little bit more detail moving forward. So here is the, so here is the social determinants of vulnerability framework that came out of that analysis, which gets us to approximately 7 categories that jumped out from the literature that were associated with one another. And then what you'll see is the relationship also with those post-incident attributes I mentioned before. So displacement, access to services, injury, illness, and death, property damage and loss, domestic violence, loss of employment. This is what the literature is telling us about the additional levels of vulnerability that people face that are specific to what happens after emergencies. And what's interesting is that the 3 socially vulnerable categories that are most connected to the other categories are social isolation, low to no income, and people of color are connected to everything and have a direct relationship with those post-incident attributes. And so these are the types of consequences that come out of emergencies and people who are socially vulnerable who are likely to experience them at disproportionate levels. So it's not that other people don't experience them, they just happen at higher levels. So for the city of Boston, when we looked at this data, I'm not going to bore you with the outputs from the analysis, but really the most important point as you move forward is that there's over 95% of the relationships across these different categories were explained by 95% of the variability was explained by these categories that are laid out in the framework, which is really powerful confirmation of the strength of the relationship amongst these particular categories. I've also added in some additional ones that we also know for the city of Boston are higher populations. And so if we move forward, what we saw is the slight shift in the way the model looks, or the framework looks, when we look at real data for a city. So this is census tract level data. The social isolation data is proxy data, and that's a combination of folks who are in households with where there's single parents and children, and then the other side of the spectrum of vulnerability with older adults who live alone. And so they're mutually exclusive and in the literature identified as some of the highest and most vulnerable populations. And so that's where the social isolation data comes from. Everything else is straightforward and all from predominantly census data. And so there's very little difference. Kind of children have the most variability in the city. And then if we move forward, we see again that it gets a little crazier when we add in some of the other categories that came up out of the literature, and as well as that was specific to Boston, where we had very high populations. So women, people with less than a high school diploma, limited English proficiency, renters, and not having a vehicle. And when we did that, social isolation, to move forward, social isolation, low to no income, and people of color still had the most connections to the other categories, but social isolation had the most connections with all of the other categories when we looked at the City of Boston data. The other interesting thing is those are the same three categories that are, again, tied to those post-incident negative outcomes. So if we move forward, the citywide geographic analysis that was done, I didn't put all of that in here because it gets a little, it would have been too much for the time we have allotted, but just for context, though that social isolation, low to no income, people of color categories are particularly highly statistically concentrated in Roxbury, Mattapan, and Dorchester areas of Boston, which I will show you a series of maps following this in terms of the specific populations that are statistically highly concentrated in those areas. But when we think about those poor outcomes that were directly connected to social isolation, low to no income, and people of color, these are the areas of the City of Boston where those three categories are most highly concentrated and related to one another. So moving forward, these maps that you're seeing from this point forward are all hotspot maps. The darker the red, the more highly concentrated, statistically speaking, those populations are in those areas. The darker the blue, the less or the smaller concentrations there are in those areas. So for social isolation, again, that's the proxy data. These are the areas of the City of Boston where they're highly concentrated: Roxbury, South Dorchester, Mattapan, a piece of Hyde Park. So these are the southernmost areas of the City of Boston. If we move forward, we see low to no income. Similar pattern, but it starts to bring in other areas of the city, including in the northwest of the city, obviously Alston, Brighton, huge immigrant community there. And then we have in East Boston a huge immigrant community as well, particularly from South America. For people with disabilities, statistically significantly concentrated in those same areas of Roxbury, Dorchester, South Dorchester, and Mattapan, with some in that East Boston area with where we have the high concentration of South American immigrants as well as the South End. And then the next one will show you people of color. And for, again, you see the high concentration of those populations in those same neighborhoods, and extends even further down into the city, to the southernmost areas of the city, including East Boston. And then this last map is children. And this is where I think there should be a level of urgency, because we also see the overlaying of high concentrations of children in these same areas. So when we think about the complexity and the interrelated nature of vulnerable populations, that we don't look at them as kind of a homogenous group or completely separate from one another, but that there are these intricate relationships that look different in different neighborhoods. And so this gives us opportunity to be able to dig a little bit deeper in neighborhoods and look at how these are connected to one another across different neighborhoods. And so the implications for this on how we think about emergency management mission areas moving forward is really related to how the core capabilities have been laid out, is how I've kind of framed this for today. So when we look at mitigation, we're looking at kind of risk and disaster resilience assessments, the community resilience pieces, long-term vulnerability reduction. And in those categories, this is really the foundation of how we move forward with our emergency management work. This is what determines how we are going to fund things. This piece determines what we're going to focus on in response and recovery in terms of these analyses and assessments that we tend to do on these issue areas. So for the work around mitigation, this is why it's so important to include analyses of socially vulnerable populations as part of this component, as well as the strengths that they bring as partners. To move forward to response, then it helps us think about public information and warning. How do we make sure that we're customizing the messages to meet the needs of our communities? How we make sure that when we're housing people, when we're providing mass care services to people, that we have these different understandings, and we understand how it looks different in different neighborhoods, including critical transportation, which is really evacuation. And then under recovery, this idea of health and social services, housing, and economic recovery. Again, making sure that we're partnering with communities, that we fully understand how those needs are going to be different in different neighborhoods, and that people are part of the process of decision-making in moving this work forward. So what we have done, as I mentioned earlier, is really looked at the ways that individual preparedness has kind of been the way that we've engaged with communities around what they need to be doing. And so moving forward to doing that, as well as looking at the way we can build in resilience for people and infrastructure in the environment as we're looking at these different issue areas. And so when we move forward and we look at kind of the what are some of the ways of thinking about the way we can bring people together, and some of the protective factors, the benefits of these types of connections, both the relationship between people and government, particularly emergency managers and other city agencies that we partner with, that there's this personal, interpersonal connection as well as the institutional piece, and all of those are protective factors that the research is showing us leads to better outcomes after emergency, so that those social connections and those social to institutional connections are really key determinants of success or resilience after emergencies. And this has been looked at across the world, globally. And so the opportunities that we have to work with communities, not just as recipients of our services, but as partners who bring a level of context expertise to help us untangle some of the what the research is showing us from the numbers, and that we're helping to facilitate those relationships, and that when we're providing the recovery services and response services, that we're really supporting some of the key levels of needs within our communities, particularly as we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So moving forward, the other huge barrier, particularly when it comes to social justice issues, and using racism as the example of the focus for today, is, and the reason I do this is because when we look at the data across the city, and this is the case in most cities in this country, that there's this disproportionate burden on communities of color on a day-to-day basis across many different issue areas is not just the result of individual behavior. Statistically speaking, it just isn't possible by accident that there would be such disproportionality. And so just looking at our understanding of these issues, because it matters in terms of how we think, how we come to the table as partners in this work. And so reframing the way we think about social justice issues. So if we're talking about racism, that it's really about the bias that we have and the stimulus that initiates that unconscious bias that we don't always know that we have unless we learn about it, unless we take the opportunities to understand how this racial bias that we have opportunity to disrupt holds up the system of racism and other social injustices, and that there's an opportunity for us to impart within there this critical practical consciousness around how do we ask ourselves questions about any ways that our policies or practices around emergency management are disproportionately burdening or excluding communities of color and other marginalized groups. And so this is an opportunity for us to be action-oriented as opposed to perpetuating inequities by just doing what we've always done, which is kind of how it works. So just a little bit of framing in terms of looking at kind of this as an important part of the way we in government and those who are emergency management practitioners are embedding equity into the way that the lens that we're using around resilience and emergency management. And so just this proposal moving forward around balanced approaches to building resilience. And I just wanted to, in emergency management, and I just wanted to share with you a great quote that came from a conference I was at, which is Disasters Fracture Us Along Fault Lines That Already Exist, this recognition that the benefits of resilience that helps us are this connection between the day-to-day circumstances of people, infrastructure, and environment that really plays out when there are emergencies that just lift the covers off of those issues and worsens them. So thank you very much for allowing me to walk through this. I know I went through it quickly due to technical difficulties, but hopefully we'll be able to address any questions on the other end and fill in the gaps that there may have been left. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Martin, for taking the time.
And I am able to stay on afterwards to answer questions.
Okay, wonderful. Well, then we'll move right into the next presentation, just in the essence of time, and we appreciate you being able to stay with us. Next, we have, excuse me, next we have Matthew Little, who's with the Partnerships and Engagement Branch for FEMA. His presentation today is going to focus on resources that FEMA has to support whole community preparedness. And so with that, Matthew, you now have the floor.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Can everybody hear me okay? Hoping that you can. Hearing no comments, I'll keep on going. So again, my name's Matt Little. I work for FEMA in the Individual and Community Preparedness Division. So we're part of FEMA that works on programs to directly impact families, individuals, and community-based organizations. As I get further along in my presentation, you'll see plenty of slides that cover down on what that's all about, but I really want to focus on some of the ways that local communities can interact with those around them, whether they're part of government or elsewhere, to further preparedness and resilience. Just as a note here, the cover photo of this slide comes from Greensburg, Kansas, which we consider, at least I consider, one of the most successful disaster recoveries because it truly did incorporate the opinions of the community, the process that was undertaken to develop their long-term recovery plan, the kind of inclusion that they demonstrated from community groups, from individuals, from advocacy groups, really shows what's possible when you do it right. So if you're looking for an interesting read, go back and take a look at Greensburg, Kansas's recovery from a 2007 tornado. I'm going to move on here. And what you have here is our FEMA mission. Of course, it's to support our citizens and first responders to ensure that as a nation we work together to build, sustain, and improve our capability to prepare for, protect against, respond to, recover from, and mitigate all hazards. And of course, for ICPD, the division that I work in, our citizens are where we are targeting, although we do work very closely with first responders at times to ensure that there's good community inclusion in the programs and activities that they're undertaking. We've got a cycle here, but what I'd actually like to do is move to the next slide, which shows the National Preparedness System. So here you can see it on the slide. And for those of you who are working in this space, this is certainly going to be familiar to you. You can see exactly what we try and do when we work inside of a community to help them build and sustain capabilities, test those capabilities, and then plan accordingly to either improve or to hit new targets and new capabilities for whatever the hazards are that they're most likely to face. So here you can see the cycle. Certainly identifying and assessing risk is a fantastic opportunity to incorporate the whole community. Estimating capability requirements, again, we're looking at what the entire community can contribute to preparedness, response, and recovery. So this is not simply a government-focused activity, and therefore should incorporate the inclusion of others from the community. Building and sustaining those capabilities is important. Planning to deliver them, validating, and then reviewing and updating. So in our work, we see opportunities for full community inclusion throughout this entire national preparedness system cycle. The one where ICPD sits, for your awareness, is typically in building and sustaining communities. That's at about 4 or 5 o'clock on this circle here. And that's where we like to plug in. We have several programs, many I'm sure you've heard of, where local communities can take these programs, use them as a way to interact, help set goals, and then build and sustain capabilities as they develop them towards a more resilient community overall. I'm going to pause for 1 second and just take a look and make sure there aren't any questions popping up for me, and I don't see any that I should address at this point. Oh, here's an easy one for me. So again, my name is Matt Little, L-Y-T-T-L-E, and I'm the Branch Chief of Partnership and Engagement in ICPD, the Individual and Community Preparedness Division at FEMA, and I'll have my contact information on the last slide. Great, so let's go to the next slide here and take a look at some of the key initiatives that come out of the Individual and Community Preparedness Division. I got these slides here. I can go ahead and click forward. So again, I just want to make sure that I emphasize the idea that at ICPD we consider ourselves, a content generator, a energizer, someone who can, in an office that can highlight some of the great initiatives that are taking place around the country. We try and provide the resources available on a federal level, but we also want to be sure that they are adaptable so that they meet the hazards that you may face in your local community, that they meet the needs and resources of a particular community, and that they can reflect what makes your community so great. So first, we have here protective action research. This is something that's very important to us. We take a look back at the data to ensure that what we are recommending to keep people safe in times of disaster is truly validated in the science. So if you go to our website, ready.gov/prepare, you'll notice that we've got it broken down by hazard, and any of the actions that we promote or suggest through any of our media channels, including that website or on our Facebook or Twitter pages, are all validated in science, and we hope that you'll see those resources and protective actions and consider using them in your own communities, knowing that they have been validated. Next, we have our preparedness outreach efforts. This goes right in line with Preparathon, which is the next block over on this slide here. These are opportunities for communities to take action, to move beyond just the awareness phase of preparedness, talking about making a kit or having a plan, and actually getting communities moving. It's very, very important for us that we do this. When we look back at the protective action research and some of the other research that we do, we know that folks are twice as likely to take an action to prepare if they've heard hazard-specific information in the past 6 months. So that's why it's so important that we have these opportunities, not only to tell people what the hazards are that they face, but what they can do about it, because we know that simply hearing that information makes them much more likely to take action. The next one I'd like to point you towards is the ICP Awards. That stands for Individual and Community Preparedness Awards. That application period is coming up in the springtime. We would love for you to keep track of that. If you're doing something innovative and exciting in your community, we encourage you to apply for an ICP award. This is not only a way to recognize your community for the fantastic work that you're doing, but it's also the chance to show others around the country what's possible when we have true whole community inclusion in our preparedness, response, and recovery activities. ICPD is a part of FEMA that runs the National CERT program, Community Emergency Response Teams. There are over 600,000 trained CERT volunteers in the nation, over 2,700 programs across the nation as well. If you don't have one of those nearby, then it's certainly something to look into because it's been so successful and so adaptable for individual communities. If you do and you haven't plugged in with them already, then I highly suggest you do that once we get off of this call. I'm actually coming to you right now from FEMA's Emergency Management Institute in Emmitsburg, Maryland, where I'm taking the CERT Train the Trainer and Program Manager courses this week. So down into the bottom line here, the first two boxes are so incredibly important, and these are resources that I hope you'll consider reviewing once we get off of this webinar. That's our youth preparedness activity. So within our youth preparedness program, we have a council. It's a national council that handles all sorts of activities related to youth preparedness. Not only are they disseminating new research and new ideas about preparedness, they're also taking action with preparedness projects in their home communities and then advising us at FEMA about how we can do better. So that application period for Youth Preparedness Council members opens very, very soon. I encourage you to keep a look on the ready.gov/prepare website and other FEMA media channels. When that opens, we're going to be looking for the best and brightest and most engaged 9th to 11th graders, I believe that's correct, to be able to join us for a one-year stint to tell us what we can do better, how we can engage with their peers, and really improve preparedness amongst our youth, because we know that youth are certainly going to be the drivers of a culture of preparedness moving forward. To the left of that is our national strategy for youth preparedness education. We've got over 60 national organizations that have signed on with us and said, yes, this is the way to help prepare America's youth. So I very highly encourage you to look for that on the FEMA website and consider implementing some of the strategies that are included in that document in your own communities. I think that's a really fantastic resource, especially if you're trying to get into schools, after-school programs, boys and girls clubs, and others that are really focused on youth. Now, I'm very, very excited to tell you about You Are the Help Until Help Arrives. This is a new program, a new campaign that and a new initiative, that we have here at FEMA in the Individual and Community Preparedness Division to help boost the confidence of those that find themselves caught in a traumatic incident. So if you come across a car accident, if you get caught in some situation where those around you have been injured, this training allows you, gives you the skills so that you can actually respond and help save a life. Sadly, we know that for those under the age of 46, the most common cause of death is trauma-induced accidents. So we really need to start taking steps so that those around can provide help to people who've been injured until professional first responders can arrive. And this program, this is now available, or will soon be available for you to train on and to bring to your stakeholders and to your communities. Now, there's a couple things on here that, that aren't on here that I'd really like to mention. One is to piggyback off of Dr. Martin's work. We've been looking into preparedness messaging in historically underserved populations. So we want to know, is the messaging that we're promoting, those same protective actions that I mentioned up top, is that really making it down to individuals who need it most, those who are disproportionately affected by disasters? And sadly, what we're finding is that it is not. So we're currently in the process of doing some research, speaking with national subject matter experts to figure out how we can adjust our messaging, not just our platforms, but specifically the message. What can we say differently so that it truly resonates with those that are disproportionately affected by disasters? And at the end of this, you'll see my contact information. I hope that you'll consider reaching out to us to keep track of that initiative, because we hope by the end of the year to be able to share some findings related to that. So those are the key initiatives that I wanted to point out. These resources are available for all. And of course, those of us at in the Individual and Community Preparedness Division would love the opportunity to work with you to help implement on the local level. Now, I have one more slide here, and this is on behalf of some of the other parts of FEMA that we work with very closely. The Emergency Management Institute offers independent study courses, online interactive exercises, and other training specifically designed to help you get started when it comes to whole community inclusion in your preparedness activities. One of the courses I'd like to recommend to everyone on this webinar is Building a Roadmap to Resilience, a whole community training. I don't have the course number here, but that's E426. E426, Building a Roadmap to Resilience. I'd highly encourage you to check that one out. What it offers is that chance for first responders, emergency managers, and those involved in community activity to consider how to form a community coalition using tools and ideas around social capital and disaster resilience to foster partnerships, build a coalition, and move the community towards resilience. So it's a great opportunity to do that. We're doing that twice a year here at Emmitsburg, Maryland, at the Emergency Management Institute, but it's also available for local delivery at your FEMA regional office, in a state office, or even on the community level if we can pull enough folks together. So in the interest of time, to allow other speakers to get on, I just want to leave my contact information up here for a minute. We really do look forward to hearing from you, hearing what works for you. And again, I'd like to encourage you to consider nominating your community for an Individual and Community Preparedness Award later this spring so that we can truly highlight some of the great successes that are taking place in inclusive emergency management. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. We really appreciate you sharing the different resources that FEMA has for communities and emergency managers to support whole community planning. We do have a couple of questions, and I actually would like to pose a couple of questions for you, and then Dr. Martin, who's, I thank you so much for still being with us. Are there any national organizations that you could recommend or that FEMA does work with that is made up mainly of city municipalities versus just those that are for state, county, or federal agencies?
Well, certainly this is Matt again, and just speaking from some familiarity, we certainly rely on national nonprofit organizations that work with municipalities, associations such as NACO, the Big City Emergency Managers, certain IAEM, that's the International Association of Emergency Managers, certain caucuses within that forum, and others we really truly rely on to help us get to the ground level of what we can do to build resources for local communities.
Thank you, Matt. And this question is for Dr. Martin. Dr. Martin, are you still with us?
I am.
Okay, great. So with your study, did you explore how the emergency operation? I'm sorry, Dr. Martin, that's in your office sounds like.
Sorry, can you repeat that? You cut out a little bit.
I said, did you explore how the emergency operations plan with the city of Boston or governmental units of Boston are working socially vulnerable?
Yes, we are more as a follow-up to the research and looking at, number one, how we do our mitigation assessment or planning, as well as the risk assessment, because that's really where we begin in terms of how we prioritize the actions that follow up. And so we're actually, as part of the City of Boston's resilience strategy, looking at how do we make sure that we're incorporating community partners as well, particularly from vulnerable populations, into the planning process from the beginning. And so there's been some gaps leading up to this. And when we look at the assessments we've done in the past, we kind of mention vulnerable populations, but we don't necessarily do the full overlay on top of things. And this is where we get into some of the principles of resilience around breaking down silos across different departments, because there are a number of departments who are already working with communities and looking at how do we connect the dots between those city agencies to make sure that we're not doing things in silos, and we're not, on the emergency management side and resilience side, aren't being exclusive or excluding anyone. So the initial reports and assessments that we've done fall a little bit short, and so we're looking at how do we bolster that and create new partnerships as well as build on top of ones that already exist.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. And so with that, we're going to everyone on the line, we do apologize. We are experiencing extreme technical difficulties today. We are going to move into the next presentation, which will be presented by Robin Foman, who's talking to us about community resilience and equity, and specifically how this work was done as it relates to disasters in King County, Washington. She's going to be followed immediately by Nicole Johnson, who is the Access and Functional Needs Coordinator with the Department of Emergency Management in Pierce County, Washington. So now, again, we're going to have Rob Foman, the Resilience and Equity Program Manager for King County, Washington. You have the floor, Robin.
Thank you. So just to clarify too, Nicole and I work very closely together in our Seattle-Uwasi region. She's in Pierce County, and we decided it'd be easiest if I just covered this rather than kind of splitting it up. She is available for questions, but she's not planning on speaking specifically on this topic. So I wanted to just tell you a little bit of a story, and that's how I'm framing this in terms of the evolution that we've really experienced around how we handle our work in emergency planning for populations that have historically been marginalized but are also facing health disparities on a daily basis and then kind of are exacerbated in emergency. Initially, when we started this work back in 2005, just after Hurricane Katrina, we called ourselves the Vulnerable Populations Action Team, really from that vulnerable to health disparities perspective. We worked with our Seattle-Uwasi region, our partners. We get some urban area securities initiative funding in our region that has been prioritized for the last several years on vulnerable populations planning. And we've worked to establish really vast networks with our community partners around agency emergency planning. We have a website to support agencies with their emergency planning, and we've essentially tried to help that paradigm shift working with community-based organizations, that they do have this emergency role to play, that leveraging their expertise from the services they provide on a daily basis in an emergency is really critical. So we've worked really hard to prepare them and help work with them to be prepared to have an emergency response role. And so in that, we had a very traditional preparedness mind frame. We focus on agency emergency planning. We often were the conveners as a public health agency. We were very response-oriented, so the short-term kind of immediate response. We'd focus on things like pandemic flu or winter storms, so it was very disaster-focused, and then working back from there typically. It was risk-focused, so we'd focus on the most immediate risks within whatever disaster we were planning for. It was very narrowly focused on community-based organization preparedness and emergency communication. And then in the recovery perspective, it was also a very narrow focus. We had a bit of a disaster case management orientation to our work in terms of capability development. But we learned over time that, emergency preparedness is a very hard sell, particularly when you're not talking to the, white middle-class community that, has the luxury, often, and I'm being very general, obviously, that maybe just the middle-class community, where, but it typically has come from this kind of a very privilege perspective in terms of who emergency managers historically are. There's been this very focus on the individual family preparedness with that whole, historical pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of mentality in our communities and in our country, really, that the affordability, just get prepared, and have a kit, and then you're going to be set kind of messaging doesn't take into account that a lot of people in our communities might not be able to, have enough supplies or resources just for their daily needs. I think that in our community, anyway, we often are primarily planning for, the windstorm, kind of day-to-day windstorms or winter windstorms that we experience, but also we have a very high risk, or a risk of a pretty big earthquake, and so that tends to be pretty abstract and hard to conceptualize. And it really, our messaging hasn't really spoken to everyday priorities that communities face. So one of the things that really helped transition our thinking here is back in, it came out of an emergency preparedness kind of need around messaging. We had experience back in 2006 where 8 refugee immigrant community members who didn't speak English as a primary language died because of carbon monoxide poisoning following a long period of cold temperatures and no power. So that outreach to limited English-speaking populations had become a big priority for us. But during our H1N1 response, we had difficulty in communicating accurately and effectively with our local Somali population, particularly because, we were patting ourselves on the back for translating information at that time, but we've translated swine flu, into Somali. The word for pig is not a good word in the Somali language, and so we successfully kind of alienated a lot of folks. A lot of, people that we needed to make sure had the right and correct information. So we spent some time building relationships and conducting interviews with key leaders in the Somali population. We partnered with a colleague, a Somali man who had a master's in public health, and we worked together to do interviews around emergency communication, kind of vaccine uptake, and just health issues in general in the community. And there was a lot of challenges and barriers and issues that were addressed in that work. And so at the end of it, when we were trying to figure out how best to maintain this emergency communication mechanism, it made sense to the community and to us to establish a Somali Health Board, an entity that would address everyday health issues in the community, but also is able to maintain relationships between public health in the Somali community, but also then build a lot more credibility for our public health department as a good partner in the community. And so the Somali Health Board started meeting just quarterly, but now it's established itself as a nonprofit organization. It gets some funding to outreach to the Somali population for various project, efforts and projects, and they also, do things like robocall out to the membership of their mosque to warn about carbon monoxide poisoning, for instance, during a recent snowstorm that we had. So it's been a multi-use kind of mechanism that really kind of shifted the way we think about the work that we're doing. And so, now we've really evolved more. We changed our name to the Community Resilience and Equity Program instead of that Vulnerable Populations Action Team approach. We're still leveraging our established relationships, but we realize how important, those relationships are that have been established from this very narrow focus to this more broad-based kind of thinking about how we can improve the daily experience of our community members. We're cultivating community ownership and working with efforts that are already going on around issues that community members have prioritized, and health tends to be in that area. The relationships are very long-term, and we're building them over time and continuing to stay connected. It's very much more collaborative and engagement-oriented. We're not focusing, one of the big learning, we would have dumped the Somali people into our vulnerable populations categories, but really focusing more on the assets in that community rather than the vulnerabilities, because as I learned more and more about our local Somali population, it's just one of the most resilient communities I've ever come in contact with. We're really addressing those everyday systems. Tia Martin talked a lot about that as being something they're focused on in Boston, and we definitely echo that. And we're looking at health and equity as being as our core values. So it's been a pretty significant shift here. We do think both strategies can be helpful. We do need to continue to kind of speak the preparedness, emergency management language as other other emergency management and other kind of mainstream traditional emergency management kind of catches up to some of this kind of perspective. I think a lot of our funding sources are, still kind of making this transition, so working in that. So just quickly, one of the things, just to leave you with some thoughts so that I don't take up too much time, but just really working to address the daily systems and issues that are priority to communities is something that we've found to be really important. We know that just that message of personal preparedness, I think, is a very hard sell to most of our communities. I know that Seattle recently conducted a survey of folks in the Seattle area about whether or not they had emergency kits. And after hearing this message over and over again, this was only conducted in English, only 25% of people actually had, a personal preparedness plan. One of the things that we've been doing, and I've learned a lot from the climate justice folks here in our community, we're working closely on a climate change blueprint for our public health department, but some of the work coming out of the climate justice community, I think, is far ahead of mainstream emergency management and also public health to a large degree around this idea of community resilience and equity, and how communities can really start owning and empowering or having that power around the conversation in their communities, what they want them to look like now and not just in times of recovery. So we're increasingly trying to make that connection here. And then I would just say, multi-use mechanisms are worth time and effort. We are actually trying to replicate this health board model in our local Latino community, working with some of the larger community-based organizations, but also the promotores that are working in kind of defined neighborhoods. Also, a Pacific Islander Health Board has started But we are consistently looking for how we can, kind of piggyback on issues that are happening and work that's happening in the community and trying to kind of integrate this idea of community resilience that would be inclusive of emergency preparedness from an earthquake preparedness, but also climate change adaptation and preparedness as well. So that's kind of the focus that we're taking now. And those are all the slides I had, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So thank you so much, Robin. We really appreciate the information that you shared today. And so we do have a few questions, and honestly, these can be answered, by you, but then also if Matt or Dr. Martin had some information that they wanted to share. One in particular, there was a comment made. I'm sorry, Dr. Martin, can you use Thank you. So, Robin, a comment came in, thanking you for taking this different approach to looking at how we use certain languages and words and tokens to identify certain populations. Several different groups, individuals can fall under vulnerable populations, and so for you all to look at these groups and put more of a focus on equity as a whole, that's been appreciated. Has there any consideration been given to looking at some additional social service providers and providing those resources to communities, or even educating these various service providers about community resilience and what can be shared with those different isolated populations?
Yeah, so we, like I said, we do have relationships with community-based organizations. We have a communication network that we send out information through, and health advisories or health alerts. We also have a website with agency emergency planning information. We are working on kind of this transition to community resilience. We did hold a community resilience forum back in May that Dr. Tia Martin was a key featured speaker, which was great. And that, it was interesting because I think we kind of jumped into it from where we are, where it makes sense, and we actually have ruffled quite a few feathers in terms of some of the audience there who were traditionally kind of emergency management focused, who felt very uncomfortable talking about racism, and I think feel more comfortable with this kind of emergency management, kind of special populations, emergency, access and functional needs perspective, rather than talking about institutional racism and institutional oppression. So, that's something that we're continuing to consider, how to kind of help transition that. Right now, I'm spending more time within just my internal government structure, working more closely with our climate change folks in terms of it's based in our Department of Natural Resources and Parks, our Office of Equity and Social Justice, and then our public health folks who are out there doing a lot of community work, again, like I said, but they're really not thinking about it broadly from this kind of integrated, intersectional approach. So that's something I'm working on. We also have a vulnerable population response plan, and we are changing that wording too. So we have an equity liaison in our incident command system structure, and I have this equity action team that we're working to update our response plan, and increasingly we're looking at how to reframe the way we used to talk about this, even though we were never trying to use vulnerable populations to apply to, it was really from that health disparity perspective. Because, the reality of equity and emergency response is completely tied to equity on a daily basis. So it shouldn't be surprising to anybody that there's disproportionate outcomes on certain populations in an emergency, because it's happening every day. So I'm trying to really kind of change that thinking is what we're focused on to the extent we can now.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So here's another question coming from a CERT program coordinator, which is sponsored by the local fire department. There's a question about, so there's a concept of credentialing with CERT teams that are predominantly people of color and not supported by white citizen corps organizations or by local EMAs. How can those CERTs be incorporated into the functional NIMS?
You know, I think so much of this is relationship based. But I do think that would be something, that would be interesting to talk about. I don't work in that CERT world very much at all. That typically happens from our local offices of emergency management and not from the public health department. I do know locally here, like they have tried to do Spanish language CERT, but often what happens is because CERT in our community anyway tends to be, a very kind of white model. There's not people who necessarily speak English in those positions, so it tends not to be very inclusive beyond that person who's managing its kind of experience, if I can say that.
This is Matt from FEMA. If it'd be all right, I'd love to jump in on that.
Yeah, I'd love you to.
Okay, great. So first, the question is unfortunate. It's unfortunate that there are members of the community that have gone through CERT training, want to help, and aren't finding the kind of support that they need, either from their local emergency management office or from the fire service or from others. This is truly meant to be a program for all. It is community supporting community. So if there's a particular program out there that could use a boost in working with its state, regional, or local counterparts to ensure that the full resources of the community are being used, and that's definitely something that I'd like to learn more about. Many times there's a perception issue, or there's an outreach issue, or there's a just lack of access issue based on where classes are held or when meetings are held, or, as was mentioned, maybe cultural or language barriers that keep those who want to participate from participating. And we've got a lot of tips and tricks that we can provide to help bridge that gap and help remedy the situation. So perhaps at the close of the webinar, if we can put folks' contact information back up, that'd be great. But certainly willing to work with any jurisdiction that is finding trouble or having trouble integrating their CERT team into the larger effort.
Matt, this is Robin. I'm just curious, because I think the CERT team is a very structured kind of program. I think maybe part of the question is, what are the opportunities to connect maybe less formal groups to kind of a bigger system?
Yeah, so that's a good question there. I would say that, CERT is what each community wants it to be. Our key requirement is that CERT volunteers take the core 20-hour training, and that those that are training volunteers or that are managing the programs participate in the Train the Trainer or Program Manager course. That's really our main requirements. Then CERT teams can be used for whatever you wish. There's an incredible amount of diversity geographically, function-wise, and community-wise across the nation in the CERT program. So it's really up to each jurisdiction to figure out how those volunteers can be used best, and we can help guide and support that. There are, of course, other groups like VOADs, Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, on the regional and local level. There are community groups that are similar called COADs that can be incorporated. So there are many ways to get involved. And actually, if there's a particular community that's already aligned around one particular cultural group, faith group, or so on, that I would suggest that they look to their national level organizations to see if there's already a structure in place to connect to something like, let's say, National VOAD or another faith-based emergency response group.
Thank you, Matt. And so now we're going to turn to Carrie Whitehead from the Department of Housing and Urban Development to learn about how communities are basically handling things before and after the disasters with their community development block grant funds. Carrie, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Siobhan. I really appreciate the opportunity to join this panel of folks who are doing such great work and to be a part of the Access and Awareness webinar series. My goal in just the few minutes that we have left is to give participants a window into a suite of HUD programs that offer grant and guaranteed loan assistance to states, local governments, and tribes that can be used to enhance disaster preparedness or to help communities recover after disasters. And I'd also like to highlight some of the great examples of community-driven recovery planning that I've seen over the years as Program Counsel for HUD's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program and also the Section 108 Guaranteed Loan Assistance Program. So today we will start by just talking about the Community Development Block Grant assistance and what it is and what forms it comes in. We call it CDBG assistance, and it really doesn't roll off the tongue, but we'll use that shorthand. So the CDBG program is a flexible program that provides communities with resources to address a really wide range of unique community development needs. It provides annual grants on a formula basis to about 1,200 units of general local government and to states. Grantees can undertake a combination of 26 eligible activities to ensure basically decent, affordable housing, to address the most vulnerable in our communities, and to create jobs and expand businesses. So all of this in a pre-disaster context usually, but it can also be used post-disaster to meet disaster recovery needs. And that's just the annual program. The annual CDBG appropriation can vary from year to year, but in recent years it's been about $3 billion. The communities that get grants automatically, these block grants, are determined by formula, but the direct grants to local governments are called grants to entitlement communities. And entitlement communities are those that are basically central cities of metropolitan statistical areas and urban counties with populations of 200,000 or more. And then states basically have the ability to distribute their CDBG grant funds to the rest of their states, the more rural areas that don't qualify as entitlement communities. And the big thing about this program is that 70% of CDBG funds must be used for activities that benefit low and moderate income individuals. And so each activity undertaken with these grant funds has to meet a national objective that either benefits low and moderate income individuals or prevents slums and blight or addresses urgent needs within the community that have a particular urgency because existing conditions pose a serious and immediate threat to health and welfare. And so you can see the connection or tie-in there to disaster. But these funds are, as I mentioned, part of a suite of assistance. And so we also have a loan guarantee program that is privately funded, but that the federal government, HUD, guarantees, and the CDBG grantees basically pledge their CDBG grant funds as security for those loans. And then from time to time after disasters, Congress appropriates special CDBG post-disaster recovery grant funds that are, given basically to the most catastrophic disasters to address, and provide crucial seed money for long-term recovery. And again, the flexibility of this program really allows communities to meet whatever needs that they might have. There are also programs for tribal areas. The Indian Community Development Block Grant Program basically is a formula grant program, 1% of the allocation every year, and there are some other variations within the suite. Today, what I wanted to cover is the use of CDBG after disasters, but also for pre-disaster planning, and that starts with citizen participation. So all community development block grantees have to develop and follow a detailed plan that provides for and encourages citizen participation. This is a really integral part of the process because it emphasizes participation by people of low and moderate income, particularly residents within low and moderate income neighborhoods or blighted areas, and areas where the grantee is proposing to use the funds. And the citizen participation plan developed by the grantee basically has to give reasonable and timely access to local meetings, an opportunity to review the proposed activities and program performance, and then basically to address how the needs of non-English speaking residents will be met in the case of public hearings. And so to set out the rules of participation and invite participation. There are also consultation requirements for consulting as the plans for the use of the funds are being developed. And so grantees, we set out some basic requirements, but many grantees go beyond these basic requirements. And I think it's a real tool for planning in a way that is community-driven. And so community members can obviously ask to participate and follow the process. There's always a public posting requirement, so it's a good part of the program. There are some real practical considerations that come up when you're using any sort of disaster recovery fund. So one of those is the basic tension that plays out in disasters where, on the one hand, in order to have a community-driven process that can really address the needs of the most vulnerable, you have to involve stakeholders and communities so that you're determining that their actual needs are met. But on the other hand, the longer the delay, the more severe the impact in the lives of survivors. And so grantees are really working on how to address those competing values, and planning on the front end before a disaster strikes is one way to try and accomplish that. The other is really the perception gap that always has the potential to exist. So, after a disaster, the reality is that recovery funds are never enough to address all of the recovery and resilience needs of a region. And so gaps in resources can lead to perceptions of gap in outreach or intent to reach certain communities. And it's important as a planner or a local community that's driving recovery to plan for these gaps and to involve the community. And again, if you can do that before disasters, you might be able to identify where those gaps might be so that you're at least aware of them and can begin to address them. And then, of course, there are other state and local tribal pressures that are really driven by the fact that every disaster is different, and everything from the assets destroyed to the makeup of the affected communities can affect the severity of the impact. But one of the important things, again, is if you understand the pressures that apply in a community before a disaster strikes, it can help understand what the needs and gaps might be and how those might be exacerbated or expanded after a disaster. And so that's why pre-disaster planning with CDBG funds is a great potential option for communities. One of the things to highlight is that under the Community Development Block Grant Program, planning is an eligible activity. And it's not only an eligible activity, but it's one that is presumed to meet a national objective and to benefit the whole community, including low and moderate income individuals. And so it's actually something that can really help communities achieve their broader goals and really target limited federal assistance. I mean, we have a trend now of federal assistance declining over time, but subject to this planning and administrative gap, which limits the amount of planning activities to about 20%, so that you're actually doing activities with at least 80% of your grants. You can basically do any planning activity that ranges from data gathering to studies to urban design and historic preservation activities or general environmental assessments, including how to plan for energy use and conservation or floodplain and wetlands management, and disaster planning. And so it can be a useful tool for pre-event recovery planning at the neighborhood level, looking at neighborhoods that are more susceptible to particular risks, or doing a risk assessment across your entire community. And so it's something that communities can ask for and community groups can ask for as part of the use of their CDBG disaster recovery funds. The consolidated planning process is essentially the basically an application for different types of block grant assistance beyond, including community development block grant, but also including funds that are with various different programs, the Home Investment Partnerships Program, Emergency Solutions Grants Program, and Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS Program. But as part of that consolidated planning process, there's a real needs assessment that happens within with all of these grantees to look at their needs before disasters, and you can use this as an opportunity for disaster planning as well. So I want to draw your attention to two resources that we posted in the resources and materials section that you can download during this meeting. And one of them provides links to additional resources that you can use in your communities to basically figure out or find out how to use community development block grant assistance for hazard mitigation or for disaster planning before and after disasters and for community-driven processes. But also, we provided a couple of examples in there that will be useful to you for people who've had real success on the ground using community development block grant funds to make a difference in their community with community-driven planning, recovery, and specifically, we included an example from New York State and then an example from Shelby County in Tennessee. And those are linked. And then the other resource is the Greenprint concept map that is related to the Shelby County example that really talks about how Shelby County developed a Mid-South Greenprint project that layered parks and greenways, social equity, transportation access, health and safety, housing and neighborhoods, workforce and economy, long-term planning and a sustainable environment as part of their disaster recovery plan. They really had an extraordinary focus on equitable participation, community ownership, and also on meeting the needs of the most vulnerable, particularly in the areas of housing and workforce development. So I encourage you to look at those examples. They are provided and linked there. And I'm going to turn it back over just in the interest of allowing a few questions here at the end and to Siobhan to let her close things out.
Thank you, Carrie. And we do have quite a few questions, so I'm going to try to get through as many as possible. So one, there's a question about suggestions on how to get community people to come to workshops on disaster preparedness, and this is for the group.
So
this is Matt.
Oh, go ahead, Matt.
Sorry, well, I'll just say it's time for us as emergency managers and preparedness folks to flip the script and figure out how we can work our messaging into what's already taking place in the community. People have a lot of asks in their lives, and taking specific time out to come to a workshop just about preparedness is not going to cut it. So finding ways to do something shorter, integrating it into PTA meetings or faith-based organizational meetings or community group meetings or other meetings like that, that's the way to really get it done, in my opinion.
Thank you, Matt. Any feedback from anyone else? Robin, I know that you're local.
I had to take you off mute. Yeah, I would just echo. Not make it about emergency preparedness, and try to find, issues that people are already meeting about that are important to them. And also, I think it's about building relationships with people over time and groups over time, and not just like kind of coming in, doing your little personal preparedness spiel and then leaving, but maybe more about conversations about what does preparedness look like to that particular group of people. What can resilience mean? Really accentuating, because I think there's this dynamic like, oh, if you don't have a kit, somehow you're bad in our society. You're unprepared and you're going to be screwed. And instead of kind of shifting the way you think about it in terms of like your relationships, what are the resources you have available to you, and kind of more empowering kind of perspective of how to think about this stuff. Because I think it's really hard to expect that the whole community is going to come and spend a lot of time in emergency planning. And what we do often is kind of expect that, the systems work every day, and in emergency management then writes plans that we're just going to leverage those systems in an emergency, with totally ignoring the fact that a lot of these systems are very broken for a lot of our community members on a daily basis.
And this is Tia. The only thing I'll add is just this idea that that community engagement in general is a challenge for government, and that we have a framing that is more about outreach than about engagement, which has a whole spectrum. And at the foundation of that spectrum is what was just stated by Robin, which is the relationship building component, and seeing residents not just as recipients of what we're doing, but as partners who can help educate us to do better and be better in terms of how we approach emergency management and what we're thinking about, because they're the context experts on their neighborhood, on their communities, and what they need, as well as what they have to offer in support of emergency response and recovery.
So I know it's 2:30, but we do have a few more questions that I'd like to get answered. And, for those of us who are still with us, we really appreciate you for holding on and hanging in there while we work through the technical difficulties for today. So with the next question, it says, who and how, do you work with to create networks with the disabled, especially when they need help, with mobility during disasters? They often go through, similar issues as those who are fall into the vulnerable populations category, but usually vulnerable populations tend to refer to the young or the elderly or those that are culturally, isolated. But what about those people who have special health care needs? Who and how do we create networks to deal with to help those people in the wake of disaster?
So this is Carrie. I just want to call folks' attention to the other resources document that is posted. One of the resources that we've listed there is a publication that's put together by the HHS Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, and it's a recovery planning topic collection, but it is a link to a collection of guidance that hits this topic very in a detailed manner, and it highlights planning guidance and guidelines, tools, lessons learned, and promising practices, particularly in this area, that are especially important for assisting healthcare emergency planners.
And then this is Tia. Just the only other thing to add is for people with disabilities versus people with special medical needs. They're two different groups, and sometimes they overlap. But I know in the disability advocacy communities, they're very clear, and they also, based on previous emergency responses, that there is a misconception that they have special medical needs as opposed to some of the more functional and access needs in order to support them during emergencies. And so just in terms of framing and how we talk about it, I know that's an important point that has been brought up on several occasions at the national and for us at the local level too. And then the only other thing I'll add is that there's usually at the local level, you have your public health department, and you also have, at least I know in Boston, we have a commission that works with people with disabilities and really partnering very closely with them, because they have all the connections to other organizations that are not government who are focusing on these types of issues. And on the public health side, that we're partnering across public health preparedness and emergency management to coordinate on these special health care needs, and as well as leveraging public health as partners with healthcare.
Thank you.
This is Nicole with Pierce County Emergency Management. So we kind of take an access and functional needs approach when working with people with disabilities. And I don't think it's about creating networks. Again, I think it's about tying into the networks that already exist. So we've worked pretty collaboratively with our local Center for Independence, our area coalition for people with disabilities, and then there's a a countywide disability advisory group that we've been tying in to kind of talk about this relationship between preparedness, response, and recovery, and how the disability community can be an asset in supporting their community members, but then also helping us to make sure we're better prepared to serve them during a disaster.
Okay, so this question is for Carrie. Thank you. Do you see a connection between hazard mitigation and community development block grant planning? And do you think that a plan can cover both in your planning requirements?
So for CDBG planning eligibility, in order to actually meet that eligibility category, it has to be more general in nature and not part of the activity itself. So you could do a hazard mitigation plan. You could do something that's neighborhood-wide. When you start talking about, say, the environmental review for an actual hazard mitigation project, then you are not you're not necessarily going to fall in that eligibility. You would just fall under usually public facility, but there can be some other eligibility categories. There's 26 CDBG eligibility categories. I would note that hazard mitigation projects are often way more expensive than you could pay for just with your community development block grants alone. And the Section 108 guaranteed loan assistance is a way to sort of amplify or expand the amount of assistance available to you. You can borrow up to 5 times your annual CDBG limit to pay for hazard mitigation projects, and then they're, of course, just secured with your CDBG block grants, and you can use your CDBG block grant funds to pay down the 108 over time, or you can pay with other sources. So I would just flag that in response.
Thank you, Carrie. And there's another question about those grant funds. Are they available annually, or are they continuous within a local jurisdiction?
Community development block grants are an annual appropriation, and then they're distributed by formula. The formula has not completely been run for 2017, but you can find out how much community development block grant assistance your community received by going to the HUD website, and we did provide that link on the additional resources list, but you can find it by going to the HUD.gov and then the Office of Community Planning and Development, and then obviously the Community Development Block Grant Program. You can also look up how much your community can borrow or might be eligible for Section 108 assistance on the HUD website.
Thank you. And so we have a couple more questions if our presenters can just hang in a little bit longer. Are there any examples of communities or municipalities using solar microgrid approach to provide vulnerable neighborhoods with essential backup and electrical power?
This is a Tia. I can speak to that for at least from the Boston's perspective. We actually, as part of our resilience strategy, one of the initiatives was really about bringing equity into kind of the climate change work, which we have a whole cabinet within the city of Boston that focuses on that. And so really looking at going beyond the traditional areas of the city that we would normally place a microgrid, and looking at the combination of infrastructure and people. And so we've identified a location within a community that has a high concentration of vulnerable populations, that has great community networks, as well as looking at ways to leverage the site as a also to serve dual multiple purposes, and looking at it as a gathering place, as a way for us to support engagement and community preparedness and overall resilience, and as well as bringing down the cost of electricity within the area for those partners who join us that are not government organizations.
And this is Carrie. I would just add that on the HUD website, there is a renewable, it's a HUD Exchange website, excuse me, which is www.hudexchange.info. You can look at HUD programs, and there is a renewable energy resources section. I will see if I can figure out how to post it to the group here, but you can find there is a list of third-party resources, and there's also a list of case studies amidst other technical resources and policy guidance really designed to assist organizations who are installing renewable energy, especially on federally assisted housing.
Hey, and this is Matt. I'd just like to point out that one of our winners of the Individual and Community Preparedness Awards this year is a vendor of home solar panels and equipment, and they've used their business as an opportunity to speak to customers in the community in which they live to share preparedness information. So just a really nice way that someone took the mission of their business and the work that they do and then built preparedness around that as well. And if you're interested in that, you can find more information by searching the Individual and Community Preparedness Awards that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you, guys. We have about 2 more questions, and then we're going to be wrapping up. Again, I really appreciate everyone who's hanging in there with us. So there's a question about community meetings and how there's a tendency not to have, what we reference as more of the underserved populations in great number. Are there any suggestions that you all can make to working with faith-based organizations or social organizations or any other local any other organizations outside of those to really reach those populations and those numbers?
This is Atia. I think one of the key pieces is also looking at grassroots non-traditional organizations who are organizing within their communities. And so a lot of times we have a tendency to try to figure out how do we get people into the spaces we want them to be in. And the reality is going to community meetings is a privilege because you have to be in a certain position in your life to be able to go to them, meaning you can't be working multiple jobs or you have to have a traditional work shift or whatever the case. And so how do we take more grassroots approaches like door knocking, and that requires partnership with the types of grassroots organizations who use those strategies on a regular basis. And I think the other opportunity is really thinking about how do we partner beyond emergency management and beyond the traditional community organizations, because what oftentimes happens is those organizations become gatekeepers to the communities, and they don't necessarily always represent the spectrum of a community. So thinking creatively about building relationships and really understanding what's happening in our communities and all the amazing work that's happening at a grassroots level to work with communities and building on top of those types of grassroots strategies that actually meet people where they are. So the door knocking, riding public transportation, things like that.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, and this question, I'd like each presenter that's still with us to really think about this and share their thoughts. What do you think are some of the most significant research questions which, if answered, would truly help your programs make progress? So, on the local level within city government, Dr. Martin, Matt, with FEMA and the work that you guys do, on the county level with you, Robin, and of course, Carrie at HUD. What do you guys think are the topics of discussion or research questions that need to be posed to make your programs really work and make progress?
This is Matt. I'll go first. I really want to know what is the social and economic return on investment from preparedness and resilience activities in communities. I want to know when people are taking action, what does that mean for a community, both in making it stronger, making it more economically viable, and allowing it to recover more quickly. And I have yet to find the sort of formula that can prove to a local mayor or a county commissioner that this really does make sense. So if someone out there has it, send it my way.
And I would just say, Matt, that's a great question. It definitely would have been my first choice, but as an add-on to that, I would say we could really use some research on scalability. So, once you've got that return on investment, how do you break it down so that you can get the return on investment from a neighborhood level, water swale that's going to retain water, locally, and all the way up to a much larger investment, because getting information on is usually easier when you're doing a full-scale benefit cost analysis for a large project, but very difficult when you're trying to convince each individual homeowner in a community to participate. So how do you scale that information to an individual level in a way that makes sense for a low and moderate income person who is a beneficiary of a program?
I think for, this is Atia, I think for me, those are great questions, and I think the other I would be interested in is looking at how do we bring together qualitative and quantitative approaches. I know to Matt's point, it's nice to have formulas in looking at what are some of the, the social return on investment types of approaches. And then how do we also make sure that we're including the types of perspectives that are not as easy to quantify in looking at what are some of the alternatives and what are some alternative approaches to the way that we think about telling the story of the benefits. That's not just numbers. And so how do we leverage some of those best practices around storytelling, around making sure that we're asking the right types of questions of residents, and that we're building in ways to buffer bias that we all have into the process as we think about how we frame problems and therefore how we frame the solutions to problems, because we make a lot of assumptions about communities, mainly because we're all exposed to a lot of the same information about who communities are, aren't, and just really thinking about what that means for some of the perspectives we take in emergency management. So those are two separate questions that I've kind of snatched together, but they're really two distinct pieces.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I think Robin had to jump off and go handle some things on the ground in her county. So I just want to say a special thanks to all of the presenters and also to all of the listeners today who stayed on and worked with us throughout these technical difficulties. Please accept our apologies. And, we look forward to you tuning in next month for the next edition of the Access and Awareness webinar series, where we'll be discussing gender and environmental justice. We want you to stay connected with us, so please join the EJ listserv and follow us on Twitter. Don't forget to download the resources that have been provided today, including the presentation and the green print concept map, and then also Carrie from HUD provided a document that has links to additional resources related to disaster planning and recovery. Again, we thank you so much for joining us, and we look to hear from you next time.
The leader has disconnected. The conference will be terminated in 5 minutes.